Hey, hello. As you saw on the thumbnail, today I wanted to have a kind of casual chat, kind of contextualizing my reading life through the Speak Now era. We've had Speak Now Taylor's version for about a week now. Now, I have done videos kind of pairing books with Taylor Swift in the past that haven't done super well. They haven't completely bombed, but they haven't, performed astronomically. So this is very much an indulgence for myself. However, in this context, I'm not going to be pairing books with this album. Rather, I'm going to be looking back at my reading life at the time this album came out, because this came out when I was in college, and as much as we talk about this album being kind of a transition for Taylor Swift and kind of looking at that time in between being a teenager and a young adult as a woman, that was very much where I was sitting in my reading life, and reading life was under such a big transition as well at this time. For instance, we saw the introduction of e-readers, which really transformed how we access books. Prior to that, and still a little bit through this time, my access was really limited by what my library had or what I was willing to pay for with my limited funds at a Barnes & Noble. So it was very much a transition in a lot of ways. So I kind of want to approach it with that nostalgic lens, especially in seeing kind of the fan reaction to this album and seeing young women or women that are fully grown kind of taken back to a specific time and place in their life. And I feel like for a lot of people, this album was what Fearless was for me, because I was a senior in high school when that came out, and it very much hit at a specific time in my life. But then oddly enough, this album, Speak Now, really kind of aligns with a lot of things in my reading life. Like I said before, there are also just kind of like anecdotal ties. For instance, one of my most distinct memories of college, partly because of that secondhand embarrassment thing that I struggle with, was related to the infamous VMAs. Because I watched it happen live, but it just also so happened to air right before, I think the night before maybe, our freshman reader convocation. Now, our freshman reader, or my freshman reader, was A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Beah, and they brought Ishmael Beah to speak at our college, and they also opened it up to a question and answer portion, which they really should have vetted the questions before opening it up, because sure enough, someone asked his opinion on what had happened at the VMAs the night before, which was not at all appropriate for the context of the book, if you have read that book. And if you have not read that book, it's a very moving piece. However, that's kind of where we were living, and the way that pop culture was much different at this time. There was this pervasiveness where we all had the same kind of cultural touchstones in many ways, so that was very much a piece. And so obviously that is also a big piece of the album, but it's also something I think about probably more than I should. Or something as simple as when Long Live first came out, when I was first listening to Long Live, I was very much doing like mental fan vids to Chronicles of Narnia in a similar way to how I did mental fan vids to The Way I Loved You for Outlander. Now keep in mind, this was before any show for Outlander existed, so it was really just me kind of doing some imagination while on a drive. And so the context of some of these things have changed for me, because Long Live is no longer really a Chronicles of Narnia association in my mind. I still get little flashes of mental images that peek through, but that has shifted for me. So I kind of just want to look at what my reading life looked like at this time, and in a similar way to this album, feeling very raw and kind of like you are going through someone's diary, very personal. I feel like going through my old reading lists is really personal and vulnerable in a way, and I don't know why. But looking at some of these lists, I feel a little bit more distant than I thought I would from these past versions of me. And also to note, looking at this reading time, it kind of spans the before and after of even like the Goodreads reading challenge. Because if we're looking at the album Speak Now coming out in October of 2010, the end of October, so it usually comes out right before my birthday, and this is the case. So I was about to turn 20, but I'm kind of looking at this in like the school year, because that's kind of how my life was still operating at the time. And so if we're looking like summer to like early spring, that kind of span of time. And the Goodreads reading challenge started, according to my records, in 2011. And there was a long span of time where I still considered that a new thing, even long after it was not a new thing. And so we see the kind of shifts that are happening even there. Now, to contextualize that a little bit more in case you haven't heard me mention it before, I was on Goodreads, I want to say March 2007 is when I joined. I could double check that, but I'm fairly confident because I was working at my local library at the time. I saw it featured in a magazine and joined up. So I was a very early adopter of Goodreads without realizing I was a very early adopter of Goodreads. And at this time, this 2010 to like 2011 span, I was still not using Goodreads as a social media platform. I was not really friends with people on it. It was very personal, just kind of a personal log for myself. Now, my high school records in Goodreads, even though I transferred my physical reading logs that I had to keep for English classes into the platform, I still have to take with a grain of salt in terms of the dates. I don't know if I copied all of those dates correctly because sometimes it just doesn't feel right compared to what I remember. However, looking at some of these books, looking back in this 2010, 2011 span, I realize how distant I really am from a lot of this reading. I'm like, oh, I read this then, and it really is interesting to kind of look at. And so going back to like the summer of 2010, like leading in to this lead up of October, here I have some pretty quintessential books from this era. And also because I was in college here and also because of my access, my reading was a little bit, or it wasn't as expansive, I should say. It was really focused on authors and genres and things that I already gravitated to. I mean, not that it's not the same now. And also I do want to make a note that the reading, or my reading at this time, was not diverse at all. And that's something I've really worked on from like the end of my college career through adulthood. There was just room for me to do a lot of work there, which I have tried to do and continue to try to do just because I love great stories and am always thirsting for more. But here I'm kind of like tracking the transition of me as a teenage reader to an early adult reader, though there is still that overlap of young adult and adult titles that I've really had throughout my reading career. And that seems like a broad statement, but one thing I do remember in terms of dates is that I read The Other Boleyn Girl when I was like an 8th grader. So there has always been a little bit of that. One of the big series or big titles here that is also connected to a memory I have of college is BRISINGR, the third in the Aragon series. I really enjoyed Aragon and Eldest. I did not enjoy the movie, but I really enjoyed those books. And so I was very excited for BRISINGR when it came out. And I have never finished this series because of BRISINGR. And I remember talking with my friend Kyle at a convocation a year after this based on who we were seeing, because it was a David Letterman series. We were seeing David Letterman in conversation with Rachel Maddow. And we were sitting in the audience talking. Somehow we got on the conversation of the Aragon series. And I talked about how I did not enjoy BRISINGR because it felt like 500 pages, I don't remember how many pages it actually is, of him just finding a sword. And that is all I remember about that book, and I've never finished the series. And at this point I would have to like go back from the beginning, but I remember really enjoying the twist in the second book. I believe it was the second book. And so having that same excitement going into the third to be kind of disappointed by the just kind of loading it felt like that book was. It felt like the travel between quests, but we didn't really know where we were going, and so I just never returned back to that series. And so it's kind of interesting to watch these series that I really enjoyed as a teenager either get dropped or picked back up. This same summer, I was still reading like Mary Janice Davidson books, not the Undead and Unwed series that I'd started in high school, but like her mermaid books, because that was what was available to me at the library. And they were these kind of romance, kind of quick moving supernatural series. So it wasn't necessarily like a Sherilyn Kenyon type supernatural romance. It was a little bit more like the Sookie Stackhouse books, which were huge at this time. Like, leaving the show aside, I don't think even I have the proper recollection most of the time of just how popular those books were. I read all of them, and it was also fascinating to me as a reader to watch how that series progressed, because it started to feel like toward the end of it that we were just kind of like in this rut where we reset, and I felt like Sookie wasn't developing as a character, because every time at the beginning of the book she would be like shocked at all of the supernatural things, and you're like, girl, it's been like 10 books and the supernatural has been around for a while, but they keep reminding us that she is just a simple girl who likes to go to the library and likes to do crossword puzzles. And so it was kind of interesting to see that tone difference between the books and how the show, the direction the show ended up going in. But that was kind of the same landscape of the supernatural books at this time. And then this same summer, I was still very much focused on historical fiction. It looks like I was finishing up the Lux series, which if you had asked me before I kind of revisited these reading logs, I would have sworn I read all in high school, but that is untrue. And those, as I've mentioned before, are a kind of historical Gossip Girl series. And then I also read in the adult historical fiction realm, The Winter Rose by Jennifer Donnelly. Now this was the sequel to The Tea Rose, which I was obsessed with when it came out. And I could not tell you anything about The Winter Rose at this point, and I believe I own the third one that I can't even name to you right now. I do know that I bought The Tea Rose on Kobo when I saw it on sale one time, because I was like, why did I love this book so much? Despite it being kind of like a sprawling historical fiction with a strong female lead and a romantic subplot, although a kind of like angsty, separated romantic plot, that I was like, does this hold up? I don't know, because I haven't reread it yet, but I loved that book. And that was the book that got me into Jennifer Donnelly. I actually read that one before I read A Northern Light, which is only important because A Northern Light was like a huge book and a huge YA book when I was a teen. It had a lot of accolades, a lot of buzz, and I think it's also important to remember that the landscape of discovery at this time was so much different and in the midst of changing a lot as well, because prior to college, I didn't have the internet in the same way in terms of books. I wasn't discovering books via blogs. I actually didn't really even use blogs all of that much for book discovery until the end of my college career when I discovered Book Riot. And so I don't even really remember how my book discovery process really went at this time. I remember, and this was much later, this wasn't at this time, much later being relative, I believe The Night Circus was one of the first books that I read based on like buzz from the wider world outside of like my circles or like librarian buzz, or I don't remember. Like the internet was obviously a big force at this time, but I don't remember how I discovered books or conversed about books on the internet at this time specifically, because it was in this transition. I have a couple Joanna Lindsey titles here, who is obviously a huge romance name. I don't think at this time I knew that she was one of the names associated with Fabio, because those were not the covers on the books when I was reading them. I just knew she was a huge romance name, and so I was experimenting with her books. However, she was never one of my romance go-tos. Now, what was one of my romance go-tos, and where we're seeing some kind of shifting here as well, was Julie Garwood. And here I have, or this summer I had read SIZZLE, this summer being the summer of 2010, by Julie Garwood, which is one of her contemporaries. Now, I am not a contemporary Julie Garwood fan. I am a historical Julie Garwood fan. And as many of you probably know, we lost Julie Garwood recently, and we're going to be diving into her work either next week or upcoming, depending on when I get to it, and hopefully soon. So what this tells me is that I was out of historicals accessible to me at the time from Julie Garwood, and so I was like testing the waters of her contemporaries. I believe I read a couple, but they never appealed to me in the same way that the historicals did. I also have Death du Jour by Kathy Reichs here, which is the second in the Temperance Brennan series that Bones was based off of, because I loved Bones at this time, which feels appropriate to mention with the current writer's strike, because the last writer's strike killed off one of, well, not killed off officially, one of my favorite characters on that show, Zach Addy. But this was me trying to get into the books in the same way that I was the show. I didn't get there because they're structured a little bit differently, and I was very much in it for the sexual tension in the show as much as anything, as well as the banter between the supporting cast, particularly Hodgins and Zach Addy, which is why I'm still sad about that. But I can see those interests kind of bleeding in there. And then we also see the plays that bleed into my reading life at this time. Of course they're going to. I was a theater student. Notable here, I read Picnic by William Inge. This is notable because it was the first show that I dramaturged by myself, and I remember I interlibrary loaned newspapers from Independence, Kansas, where this play was based on. And I'm still shocked to this day that they let me have these newspapers because no one asked me if I knew how to use a microfilm reader. Now, I did, because one of my jobs at the library used to be that I was the one that would like dig through all the newspapers if we had like a request for a specific article from a historic paper. Usually it was obituaries, but occasionally we'd get other requests, and so I would get to kind of pore over the microfilm of old newspapers, which was actually a lot of fun. Another play that's notable to me here is Reasons to be Pretty by Neil LaBute. Now, this is notable to me because of how much I hated this play. I was given this play by my roommate at the time to read over Christmas break because right before Christmas it had been announced in our upcoming production season for our department. So we were going to be doing it the next year. So my roommate at the time was really excited about it, gave me her copy to read over break because she loved this play so much and she was so excited we were going to be doing it. So I read it over Christmas, and I distinctly remember being in the bathtub, reading this play, my boombox probably playing like my usual go-tos, the Princess Diaries soundtrack or something. I just remember sitting there because I disliked the play so much, because to me, and it's been a long time since I've read some work by Neil LaBute. However, I remember when I was in Cleveland, which to be fair was a decade ago at this point too, they were doing a showcase and there was a monologue someone did from either a newer LaBute work or something I hadn't read, and I almost immediately picked up on it as a LaBute. I don't know if I could talk about it with the same specificity at this moment, but to me as a young woman, it just did not seem like his plays like women. So that's one of those works that's notable because you had such a visceral reaction. Unfortunately, my visceral reaction there was just very negative. And then we have The Trader's Wife by Susan Higginbotham, which is a book I've never really heard talked about, and I probably wouldn't talk about it, except it was the first book I read on my new e-reader. And that new e-reader was a Kindle at the time, and I still have it. This is my very first e-reader. I don't think I will ever get rid of this one because it was one of those models, or one of the models, that had the text-to-voice feature on it. It's not great. You're never going to prefer a text-to-voice over a voice actor, but it's something you're never going to get on an e-reader again because of the legalities of that. Additionally, I don't think I really comprehended until I was buying Persuasion last year to reread before watching the movie on Netflix that a lot of the classics that you could just download for free in the early days of e-readers are not available for free anymore. And I have a lot of free classics from this time, and part of the reason I read so many classics toward the end of my college years was because they were available for free, and so it gave me the opportunity to kind of catch up on a lot of these things in a way that I wouldn't have had before. And where I started on the classics, being a loose term because usually only The Scarlet Pimpernel is considered a classic, but I went into like all of the sequels there for a while. The first one I read on this new Kindle was basically just a collection of short stories of them getting people out and like escapades and adventures. So I actually was a little disappointed when I first read that because I wanted the kind of romance of that first book. Also because this was the same time that The Secret History of the Pink Carnation series was actively publishing, and I was reading as it published. And so those books were very similar in my mind because The Secret History of the Pink Carnation is directly pulling from the kind of Scarlet Pimpernel model. Now to swing back to The Trader's Wife just briefly, because this was the first book I read that kind of looked at the queering of Edward II, and I don't know that it would hold up today, but it's also interesting to look at how far we've come in queer representation in books since then, and it was what got me to read the play Edward II. And so those were like Christmas break books. Then we're moving into like January, which is after the album, but it's still of this moment. And this, I think, really represents a real transition in my reading life. I do think looking back on it over a decade later at this point, the introduction of an e-reader into my reading life was really transformative. And I don't remember when I actively added a library card to my e-reader or started using the library for my e-reader, but I remember I was an early adopter of that, especially because I was still working at the library during breaks or on summer vacations often, and so I was knowledgeable on that to help teach others. And then in this time also, we have books that are very much associated for me with this time, and also just as my building blocks almost as a reader in terms of what I gravitate to. We have What Happens in London by Julia Quinn, which was part of the Bevelstoke series. I couldn't really tell you at this point what that was about. I need to go back to that series, but this idea that I stayed with Julia Quinn from the Bridgertons, like this has continued. I continued to go back to her work and seek it out. We also have Shadow Fever by Karen Marie Moning, which I do believe I read the ebook of, so I must have purchased the ebook of this. And another thing to note of this early generation Kindle is that, I don't know if you can see it, but there are little tiny pressure points on both corners from, I assume, pressing the buttons. I do know I got this replaced once, I think the summer after I got it, because of those little cracks, and then it developed in this new one too, and I just decided it wasn't structurally damaging enough to go through again. I don't know. So I read Shadow Fever by Karen Marie Moning, which was the 5th in the Fever series, and I had been reading the Fever series since I was in high school. So this is another one of those like transitional author series. I started with the Highlander books, which we revisited recently because I read one for my book club, and there are the exact limitations of that book that I expected going back, you know, decades later. But this series was really a transition between romance and urban fantasy. It had cameos by a lot of the characters from the romance series, but this book, if I'm remembering correctly, was the one that ended on a huge cliffhanger, and I still remember being like, what the heck, kind of having to sit with that and thinking about how sitting with that would be so much different today as a reader, because at the time I didn't have anybody to talk about that with. I was sitting in that myself. I didn't have forums, I don't think, where I could talk about that online. I knew, you know, forums existed. Obviously, I was going into fan fiction forums a lot, but that was really limited to those really popular properties. So I may have read some reviews on Goodreads, but I really think that that's probably what my discourse was limited to, other than friends of mine that had read the same books. And I remember really bonding with one of my good college friends over the fact that we could talk about the same books together. We liked a lot of the same books. I actually bonded with a couple of people that way. One of them is now a literary agent, and so she is continuing to bring great books into my life. But thinking about that moment, and if that moment had happened today, especially on a place like TikTok, it would have been a much different thing, I think. And then we see, now, okay, this one is going to be a little bit more controversial, Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. At the time, I wasn't aware of a lot of the Cassandra Clare discourse because I wasn't in the places where the discourse was happening. So this series really revitalized things for me because I loved the setting and I loved the love triangle that developed here. And this, I think, is important to note, was at a time where we were coming out of love triangles being in everything. And so we really were seeing a lot of backlash against love triangles that I think has continued into today. Now, I think when love triangles are done well, they work well, but because so many books and series were utilizing them without it being done well, with it just feeling kind of formulaic, this was a breath of fresh air and was really exciting at the time. Again, I didn't really have people to talk about this with at the time, except for a couple of those friends who I think this may have been one of the titles we bonded over. But just thinking about how different the landscape is and how it was shifting even here, because we were seeing a lot of this change at this time. And I think the accessibility of things, with things like e-readers, with just the internet landscape shifting, because it has morphed many times in my lifetime and it's hard to remember what it felt like at the time, but that was all a part of it. And then a couple of other plays that are notable in a roundabout way. Shining City by Connor McPherson, mostly notable because I really have enjoyed Connor McPherson as a playwright, and if you have been with me for a hot second, you will remember how betrayed I felt during the Artemis Fowl movie because Connor McPherson was associated with the project, and I thought that that lent a level of credibility to what story was going to be told. I did not trust Kenneth Branagh with the story at all, but I did trust Connor McPherson as one of, in my mind, the greatest living Irish playwrights. Connor McPherson, Martin McDonagh, but Connor McPherson often plays with elements of like supernaturally things in his plays, and Artemis Fowl is inarguably supernaturally. Now, very different tones, but there is a little bit of darkness that could be mined there as well. They didn't, but this play is notable because it was the first Connor McPherson I read, and so it is going to stick with me the most because of that, I think. And then I read Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard, which is probably Tom Stoppard's most well-known work. However, based on the timing of this, I read this in February. In March, I believe, I would be going to New York for my first showcase, and it would be my first time seeing a show on Broadway. I saw How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, and I also saw my first play on Broadway, which was Arcadia by Tom Stoppard. And Arcadia changed my life. I did not shut up about that play for like the entire rest of college because it was just like catnip to me. It was nerdy, it was romantic, it was introspective, it had like these grand speeches and kind of like philosophizing, and it had this historical setting, and it was like moving, weaving in and out of like the contemporary timeline and the historical timeline. It is everything I loved, and I saw that play on Broadway, and I remember I didn't love Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead when I read it, which honestly isn't surprising because I do not like Waiting for Godot, and they're not the same thing by any means, but kind of pulling on similar things. But I adored Arcadia. And now looking back, because I just looked up when that specific revival opened, and it had Raul Esparza in it, it had Billy Crudup in it, but I did not really recognize what that meant at the time. Instead, Tom Riley was playing Septimus, and it was a fantastic performance. But I remember being in the audience and being like, I recognize this guy from somewhere. I recognized him for playing Wickham in Lost in Austin. So probably kind of a tangent, but just another kind of like weaving of like my teenage self, like that love of Jane Austen and watching like everything I could related to it, moving into my more adult sensibilities. Not that Jane Austen isn't there, but just like the new things I was discovering and the way the world was opening up for me at the time. Also to note on the theater side, though I wouldn't see it until the next year based on my photos on Facebook, because at this time everything's kind of bleeding together, but this was the year that I, with a group of other students, helped put together pre-production research for Sutton Foster in her revival role in Anything Goes as Reno Sweeney, and this has become kind of a seminal role for her, but at the time it was her first revival. It was the first time she took on a role that she was not originating, and it was a huge deal. Now, I do want to make clear that she would not know me from Adam, but she is a professor at my alma mater, and her role with the college has grown even since I was in school, so it was very gracious of her to give us this opportunity. And it was just such a fun time and such a fun thing to look back on. She sent us a picture of our research being up in the green room and my like little corner that had my Amy Semple McPherson research. So it was just neat. And then notable only because I didn't remember having read this early was Villette by Charlotte Bronte, or Villette based on the production I just saw this year, but I didn't remember reading it at this time, but it makes sense because I really enjoyed the Brontes, and this is also kind of like me bridging my classics reading. So we're seeing me really trying to get into more classics, read classics more broadly, but I'm still kind of bridging out of the classics I was drawn to in high school. And a lot of my bridge reading in college, like I said, was the classics because it's what I had accessible. I was still obviously, though, reading like romance and young adult at the time, but even seeing the way young adult has shifted since one, my time as a young adult, but then especially those college years into, I want to say, like out of college, like that 2013 era young adult felt like a major shift into what we got the rest of that decade. And it was notable. So it's just very interesting. That's obviously just a sprinkling of what I read during this era, but it's really interesting to look back at this and realize how far from this I am to feel so nostalgic about these reads. And in a way, it really does feel, like I said, like kind of like opening up a journal entry. But I also think it's just a great reminder of how far we've come in the reading world in a lot of ways too, and how much has changed so quickly, especially in terms of like book discovery, book accessibility, and just the way we talk about books, the community of that, the fact that there is a sense of community now that it didn't feel like when I was a teenager and a young adult. We formed those bonds in person, but like picking something up in the library and discovering it on the shelf felt like such a personal experience. This was for you. And there is still magic in those moments where they're found now, but there's also magic in the community that's been built around kind of discovering these things together in a certain way. And to be probably way too sentimental about it, it does feel kind of long-lived, right? This idea of this community that's been found and what we built up together, and just how much has changed over the last over a decade and how we've seen these dreams kind of realized. So yeah, thanks for indulging my nostalgia there. This probably gave you too much insight into my embarrassing past as a reader. I mean, not embarrassing. I'm not embarrassed by things I've read, but I definitely feel like it's a past version of me, even if it is still there in my present version of me, and there is a vulnerability there. So thanks for going on this journey with me. Let me know if you've read any of this. Let me know what your reading life looked like at this time, if you've tracked some of these shifts as they've come about as well, or if your reading life journey looked much different, because just even a few years difference can make a huge difference in the landscape. So just let me know where you're sitting, what you're thinking. Thanks as always for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like, subscribe, comment, whatever you're feeling, and read something good. Yeah, bye.